Good morning. Will you open your Bibles to Mark chapter 5? Mark chapter 5 is where we'll be this morning as we think about the maddening, marvelous timing of Jesus. Really appreciate those songs, Tim. I think that it goes along very well with what we'll be talking about this morning. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the embarrassing story in Mark 5 of the woman with the hemorrhage of blood and how if we're going to come to Jesus, we have to be willing to be embarrassed too. Well, this morning I want us to talk about the story surrounding that story. Mark does this sometimes where he'll start a story and then he'll interject another one and then he'll finish the story that he started. And this story is about someone who was also willing to come to Jesus despite being embarrassed, except this time Jesus does something seemingly embarrassing too. And before we get to that story, I just want us to think together about one of the most common yet maddening of all human experiences, and that is waiting on God to act. We've been in the Psalms this year for daily Bible reading, and over 30 times the psalmists asked God, how long? Abraham and Sarah had to wait 25 years to give birth to Isaac. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for over 100 years. After being anointed, it took David 15 years to finally take the throne, and much of that time was on the run from Saul. Have you ever had to wait on God? And it seemed like it was taking absolutely forever. Maybe you were waiting on Him to give you a spouse, or to help you find a career, to provide healing from trauma, to put your family back together after a huge falling out, or to heal your sickness. Maybe you're still waiting on Him now. God's timing can be absolutely maddening, and part of that is because He is our Father and we are His children. And it's actually a really fascinating study. I had to take some of this out of my talk because it was getting us off track, but it's interesting to learn why it is that time is so much slower for children. So I'll just give you one example of what I learned about that. To kids, every minute seems so long. It's why, you set out on a road trip for 10 minutes and it's are we there yet? Well, part of it is because time is a bigger proportion of the life that they have lived. So for instance, for a 50-year-old, 1 year is only 2% of their life. But for a 5-year-old, 1 year is 20% of their life. So that year feels like it's a way bigger chunk of time. Now, here's the question. How long does 1 year feel to God, who's been around for all eternity? How long does 5 years feel to Him? 10, 25? That may be half of our life and feel like forever. But for Him, it's just a nanosecond. But what we learn from our own lives and from this story in Mark 5 this morning is that His timing is also marvelous. Because when He does finally act on our behalf, He comes through in ways for us that exceed our expectations and go far beyond anything that we could have possibly imagined. So let's look in Mark 5 at the maddening time of Jesus first, and then we'll explore why it's so marvelous. Verses 21 to 24 says, when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around Him, and so He stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came up and on seeing Him fell at His feet and implored Him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following Him and pressing in on Him. So when Jesus has now crossed to this side of the Sea of Galilee, it was after having shown His power over nature by calming the sea in Mark 4. And then He showed His power over the demonic realm by casting out Legion in the earlier section of Mark 5. And on this side of the sea, He has now come to do battle with the greatest foe of all, and that is death itself. So here comes a man named Jairus. He's a synagogue official who would have had a great reputation in the community. He would have been well-liked and well-educated, very devout, and he was in charge of organizing the worship service at the synagogue service. He was put in charge of the duty roster. Okay, he determined who's preaching when, who's reading scripture when, how is everything going to be arranged, making sure everything was done decently and in order. And of course, he would have had good standing with the scribes and the Pharisees and the other religious leaders, which is what would make this so embarrassing for him. Because the scribes and the Pharisees were not fans of Jesus at all. And yet he's willing to fall down at Jesus' feet because he is desperate. And he does not care what this will do to him socially and whether he's going to lose friends in high places. He knows any embarrassment is worth it to save, and we'll learn later she's 12 years old, to save his 12-year-old daughter. And he knows only Jesus can do it. So Jairus has essentially called 911 here. And Jesus, the great physician, is on his way. The lights on the ambulance are flashing, right? And the sirens are going. And Jesus, it seems like he's on his way as quickly as he can to go and save his daughter from death. But then something happens. And we talked about this last time. But while Jesus is on his way to save Jairus' 12-year-old daughter from death, a woman who's had a hemorrhage of blood for 12 years touches him. And Jesus stops, and he turns around, and he has a conversation with her. Remember, Jairus' daughter is on the brink of death. She is about to die, and Jesus stops to talk to this woman. You can almost picture Jairus tapping his foot and, kind of looking around anxiously. Jesus, we got to go here. Okay, my daughter's about to die. You cannot be talking to this lady. We've got to move. And then look what happens. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" While Jesus is seemingly lollygagging, we might say, right? He's having a conversation with this woman. His daughter dies in the middle of that. And in that moment, the great physician doesn't seem so great at all. In fact, it would seem utterly embarrassing that Jesus would let this happen. One writer said, if he were a physical doctor, he could be sued for malpractice because no doctor would ever treat someone with a chronic problem before he treated someone with an acute problem. Just imagine, your kid gets brought into the ER. He's about to die. He needs immediate resuscitation. And the doctor says, well, there's a lady over here and she's had back problems for 10 years. And so I really need to treat her right now. No, you'd say, she's had back problems for 10 years. She can wait another 10 minutes, okay? My child cannot. So Jesus, instead of saving this 12-year-old girl on the brink of death, he chooses to help a woman with chronic 12-year-long bleeding problems. Can you imagine how maddening this was for Jairus? It would be a mixture of confusion and anger and despair. And that's how God's timing makes us feel sometimes. Yet Jesus is unfazed by this news. And he turns to Jairus and tells him not to be fazed by it either, which is a pretty tall order for someone who just learned his daughter died and watched Jesus let it happen. But let's see how this goes. Verses 36 to 43. But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official. And he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this and that she should be given something to eat. As maddening as Jesus' timing was, it was also marvelous. And let me share very quickly 5 reasons why Jesus' timing is marvelous. Number 1, it's marvelous because Jesus was with Jairus the whole time that he was waiting. Jesus literally was walking alongside him through every moment and every emotion that he faced. He never abandoned Jairus. He saw everything that Jairus was going through and was right there with them through it all. And the same thing is true of us. One of the very last things he said before his ascension back to heaven was, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." It's marvelous to know he walks with us through our pain and our confusion and our anger and our despair while we wait on him. Secondly, it's marvelous because it reminded Jairus who was in control. If you think about it, Jairus was a synagogue official used to being in control. He was the organizer, right? He organized services and he planned out the exact timing of what was going to happen and who was going to speak when. But Jesus removed his control of timing completely so he'd be forced to trust Jesus, not himself. Jesus' timing humbles and reminds us that God is in control and that we can't plan out the duty roster for our life. And as scary as that is, there's actually peace in it, because it means we don't have to worry and we don't have to be in a rush, make sure everything happens the way we want it on our schedule and our timing. We can just trust him. Jesus said, "Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care for itself." And later when the apostles, they're concerned, when in the world is the kingdom coming? In Acts 1, Jesus said, "It is not for you to be concerned about the times and the epochs which the Father has set by his authority." We don't have to know when things are going to happen. We just have to know who's in charge of making those things happen. Thirdly, it was marvelous because Jesus' timing was better. If Jesus would have ignored this woman with the hemorrhage and just immediately went to Jairus' household, that woman would not have been healed. And it would not have been nearly as impressive for Jesus to save this girl from sickness as it was to resurrect her from the dead. This way, Jesus and his Father got way more glory for their resurrection power and also for helping a social outcast. In their culture, it would have been absolutely absurd for Jesus to prioritize a woman over a man and say, "I'm putting this woman with the bleeding problem over this man." And then even more so because of the kind of man that he was, because he was a prestigious man. He was a synagogue official. He was very important. And yet Jesus prioritized helping a woman with chronic pain over this man with an acute problem. Amazing. Yet likewise for Jesus, sometimes Jesus and our Father, they wait so long because they know other things have to happen first before they can say yes to our prayer. Things that we would never even consider. Fourthly, Jesus' timing is marvelous because it showed he knew, and I think this is probably the hardest thing for us, he knew the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. How can that be? The guy's daughter just died. What do you mean the situation isn't as bad? Jesus doesn't make light of it, right? He's still compassionate. I think he knows Jairus is going through this. Later, same thing happens with Lazarus. He knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he still weeps because he sees how troubling it is for Mary and Martha. So he never makes light of our situation. But he knows, however painful and terrible our situation is, and that it seems like our whole life is over and there's no hope for the future at all, he knows it's not as bad as we think in the grand scheme of what he knows about his plans for us. And so he is trying to tell us, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. And then finally, and this is connected to the fourth point, this is why it's not as bad as it seems, because it's marvelous that Jesus came through for Jairus in a way that exceeded all expectations. He does the same thing for us. That's why it's not as bad as it seems, because Jesus knows what he has in mind is going to blow our minds. I'm sure Jairus lost heart when he found out his daughter died. That's why Jesus had to reassure him. I mean, while she was alive, there was hope. But once she died, I don't think he ever imagined that Jesus could still help her. But to Jesus, death is just sleep. And like a parent waking his child up in the morning who says, "Rise and shine," he takes her by the hand and lifts her up out of death's cold grip. And everyone, including Jairus, was completely astounded. Jesus' timing was maddening, yes, but perfectly marvelous. And here's the most amazing part. It's what I want us to think about as we partake this morning. Jesus was willing to leave heaven, to come experience, to come put on flesh and experience the maddening and marvelous timing of his Father the way we do. In Hebrews 5:8, it says, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And I think part of his suffering came from waiting on his Father's timing. I mean, you think if Jesus had his way, and he realized, okay, I have to go to the cross, you would think he'd just want to go down and just die on a cross and get it over with, and let's just go ahead and do this thing. He had to start as a baby. And he had to grow up a day at a time, just like everyone else. A year at a time, when every one of those years seemed like it would take forever, right? He's a child. He's got this really long view of time as a child. And then he had to wait 30 years before he could even start his ministry. And then when he starts his ministry, it's 3 long, grueling years of training naive disciples and putting up with evil, hypocritical religious leaders and hanging on a cross for 6 hours. I'm sure there were times Jesus must have wanted things to happen so much faster, and his Father's timing must have been maddening sometimes. But his Father's timing was also marvelous, because he walked with Jesus the whole time. He humbled Jesus to remind him his Father was in control and that his timing was always better. In Jesus' situation, as horrifying as it wasn't as bad as it seemed, because God came through for Jesus in a way that exceeded all expectations and saved the entire world. So the next time we wonder, how long, oh God, let's remember Jesus would have wondered that too, especially as he was hanging for 6 hours on that cross. And he would want us to know, as maddening as our Father's timing can be, the fact that we are all here this morning around this table is proof that his timing is marvelous.